doesn't particularly surprise me. You can spend a lot of time telling a Protestant in Northern Ireland who has a picture of King William painted on the side of his house that when King William fought the Battle of the Boyne, his ally was the Pope. The Protestant sort of knows this, the Ulster Protestant, but he doesn't really believe it's true, happens to be true. Of course it's opportunistic. Why is it opportunistic? Because religion is man-made, as I began by saying. It's what you would expect if religion was the creation of aggressive, fearful primates. It's exactly what you would expect. And the same would be true of its non-religious attempts to create paradise, because it's asking too much of people, and it leads to fanaticism and torture and murder and war. So all you succeed in doing is replacing the question. No, there's no teleology. No, there's no eschatology. No, there's no ultimate history. No, there's no redemption. No, there are no supreme leaders here or anywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you both for the thought-provoking ideas that you've presented. I have questions about the scientific things that you mentioned. One was sort of raised earlier. You mentioned the cell as this complex thing, as if it is theorized that it arose spontaneously. And I may be out of date, but I remember reading theories at some points about more chemical molecules that began reproducing much before any actual cells. And wouldn't that be an explanation of earlier life? And the second one has to do with the perfectly tuned universe and whether the logic of saying that life exists that fits this perfectly tuned universe is an indication of that somehow divinely created fits with the idea that there's evolution, and that if the universe is tuned in a certain way, that the only possibility of life with that tuning is life as it exists now. And perhaps it would be presumptuous of us to say that if it were tuned differently, there wouldn't be some other way that different forms of life would have arisen.
Let me address those points in sequence. With regard to the cell, Darwin speculated that it might have come about in a warm pond. In the 1950s, there were some experiments that generated some amino acids, and there was a lot of excitement thinking that there might be a way to recreate in the laboratory the ingredients of life. Those experiments haven't gone anywhere, but more importantly, that in the real world wasn't a laboratory. Even if you could recreate the ingredients in a laboratory using all the laboratory apparatus, it doesn't mean it happened. You have to show that it could have happened that way in nature. So the point I'm simply saying is based on current knowledge, and all arguments have to be based on what we know now. We're all open to new ideas in the future. There is currently no good explanation. And all I'm saying is that in any other sphere of life, if I was walking down and look in an alley and I see a head rolling around, I conclude that somebody committed suicide or somebody killed someone. It's a reasonable inference from the data. You could say, well, that's a rather presumptuous conclusion. There might have been natural ways in which the head detached itself from the... And there could be, but what's the most plausible under the circumstances? Normally, when we see intelligent activity, what is science but an effort to excavate intelligence out of nature? The reason we need Newton and Einstein is because intelligence is hidden in nature. E equals mc squared doesn't jump out at you. You gotta test nature and pull it out. So if nature is an embodiment, a network of intelligent systems, isn't the most reasonable explanation that intelligence put it there? If we need intelligence to get it out, how to get there in the first place? This seems to me to be nothing more than a direct inference from the facts. Now, I want to say a word about Larry Krauss, who was mentioned earlier, the physicist. The universe coming out of nothing. There's a lot of verbal jugglery that's going into all this. Imagine if I were to try to show the following. Money comes out of nothing. Proof? All assets will be counted as plus. All liabilities will be counted as minus. The pluses and minus cancel out. We have money, but there's a zero on the balance sheet. Money comes out of nothing. You would say this is a little bit sleight of hand. Basically, what's going on today is what physicists like Krauss do is they identify all energy as positive, but all gravitational energy as negative. They presume that the total amount of positive and negative energy cancels out, and therefore the universe came out of nothing. It didn't really come out of nothing. There's a whole lot of energy there, but by defining one kind of energy as plus and another kind of energy as minus, presto, they cancel out, and you've got... So what I'm getting at here is I want to show the acrobatics to which modern atheism has to go. This, by the way, is not science. Krauss is trying to make an atheist argument in an atheist venue, drawing on science. But I'm saying, look at the lengths to which the guy has to go to try to defy the normal operations of reason to tell us that not only a molecule, but an entire universe, wow, popped out of absolutely nothing. You can believe it if you want to, but it sure does take a lot of credulity.
I'll try and be terse, but first, I earnestly entreat you, ladies and gentlemen, to watch Professor Krauss's lecture for yourself and not accept that parodic version of it. On the nothing question, as it touches on ourselves, as it happens, it's rather more marvelous than almost anything in any holy book. All the elements from which we and our surroundings are made are from exploded stars, from the stars that blow up and die at the rate of 1 every second and have been doing that since the Big Bang. Isn't it rather magical to think that we're all made out of stardust? Never mind, as Professor Krauss says, never mind the martyrs. Stars had to die so that we could live. This is a very essential reflection to be having, and it dwarfs the religious explanations. You didn't notice, Dinesh, that the gentleman asked at the end, couldn't it have turned out another way, which I think was possibly the crux of his question. I'd recommend another study to you. Sorry. Excuse me. Professor Stephen Jay Gould, who I mentioned flatteringly earlier, in spite of my disagreement with him about the non-overlapping magisteria, did a marvelous paleontological book called The Burgess Shale. This is a half of a mountain that's fallen away in the Canadian Rockies, revealing the whole interior core of a great mountain. So you can read off as if on a screen it's more like a bush actually than a tree, all the little tendrils of evolution of reptiles, birds, plants, and so on as they sprout up, branch off. And many of them stop. Nothing happened to them. They were quite promising, but they went nowhere. And it doesn't go up like a tree. It goes all over the place like a bush. Well, says Professor Gould, it's one of the most unsettling, vertiginous thoughts I've ever heard from a paleontologist. Suppose that we could, which in a way we can, rewind this as if onto a tape. Get the Burgess Shale, get the outlines of the book, rewind it, play it again. There's absolutely no certainty it would come out the same way, that all those branches would go off and diverge and die out or flourish in the way that they do as they did. It's completely governed by uncertainty. There are any number of conceivable outcomes up with which evolution could have come. It's another version of our selfishness, our self-regard, I might say, our solipsism, that we cannot easily unconvince ourselves that all of this happened so that the Pope could condemn masturbation.
If I can offer a very, very brief rebuttal. We're now plumbing into the depths here a little bit. I do want to point out that Gould's thesis, rewind the tape of life and it would come out differently, which is by now a few decades old, is challenged by the world's leading expert on the Burgess Shale, Simon Conway Morris, a paleontologist in England, and also by Christian de Duve, a Nobel laureate in chemistry. And their argument is no, that essentially Gould had it wrong. Gould was guessing that every evolutionary pathway would cut very differently. But the latest evidence is that that's not so. Consider the evolution of the eye. For a long time, in a sense, 6,000-year creationists would say, how could the eye evolve? Turns out that the eye has evolved multiple times, and it's evolved in similar ways. That is telling us that evolution is not this random thicket. It tends to converge to solutions that are similar, even when faced with different kind of organisms and different kind of problems. So I recommend to you not only Conway Morris and de Duve, but also a book called Rare Earth by the paleontologist Brownlee, which basically looks at why we haven't found life on other planets, rare earth. And their conclusion is that the conditions for life to exist are so particular that it's actually reasonable to expect that life exists only here, only on this planet. It seems almost incredible, but when you think about it, it actually makes sense. Consider this. Our life is completely dependent on the sun. The sun is
This is more than brief.
Oh. You're right, I'm being carried away, so I'll stop here and we'll go to the next question.
Do you have a very brief reply?
It's so nice and how much we progress. No one now argues against the evolution of the eye. Now the argument of the evolution of the eye is completely conceded, and then it's used against Stephen Jay Gould. The thing to read there is Richard Dawkins' chapter on the multiple evolutions of the eye, including the fish that have four, is to be found in Climbing Mount Improbable, to which I also recommend you. I agree with you that it's very overwhelmingly likely that our planet is the only one that supports life. Certainly, we know in our own little suburb of the solar system that all the other planets don't support life. They're either much too hot or much too cold, as are large tracts of our planet, and we have every reason to know now that we live on a climatic knife edge, and in the meantime, our sun is preparing to blow up and become a red dwarf. I ask you, whose design is that?
We will take one more question. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to let their reply to this question also double as their closing remarks.
Now I feel bad, though.
It better be a
Choose
great
well, man.
Okay,
Tread softly, for you tread on our dreams.
my question is for Mr. Dinesh. You talked before about, well, the improbability of a lot of things, and given the improbability, the necessary meaning of certain things. So because of the improbability of life in some circumstances, because of the uniqueness of life here, that this implies something. How would you respond to the thought that maybe there doesn't have to be any meaning? That, say, as existentialists would say, there's no inherent meaning, but we can create our own meaning. So I guess my question is, why must there be some inherent purpose or some trajectory? Why can't things have just happened, albeit maybe very improbably?
I think that you misunderstand my argument if it is an inference to meaning. I'm not saying we have improbable events, we've got to figure out some kind of meaning. No, I'm making inference to a cause. David Hume, the great skeptic, said there is no event that occurs without a cause. Now, true, in the weird world of the quantum, we can find exceptions to that rule. But quantum effects cancel out when you come to macroscopic objects. And whenever you hear someone say, consciousness, I really don't know what that is, but perhaps it's a quantum thing, he's basically saying he doesn't know. The quantum is invoked to explain things that are unexplained. Here's my point. Here's the argument tightened up. Everything that has a beginning, all material objects that have a beginning, have a cause. The universe is a material object that has a beginning. The universe has a cause. The cause could be natural or supernatural. The cause cannot be natural because nature can't cause itself, unless Professor Krauss is right. Since the cause can't be natural, it's more believable that a supernatural being, and moreover a supernatural being with a lot of power and a lot of knowledge and a lot of concern for us, because life is the outcome of this process. These are reasonable inferences to a cause. I mentioned earlier the three big questions. Christopher said science has provided answers, and he restated all my three questions. So none of them were my original questions. So for example, when I said, where are we going? My point was, what happens after we die? Is there life after death? We don't know. The atheist doesn't know, the believer doesn't know. The atheist who says there isn't, just like the believer who says there is making a leap of faith. Christopher avoided the question by changing it to, will the universe come to an end? Will the sun blow up? That wasn't my point. My point is what happens to us after we die. That is unknown. Science has no insight on that question. And here's a final thought. Very often we use evolution as a catch-all explanation, but we don't subject evolution to the critical scrutiny that we subject religion. For example, Christopher invoked earlier, and it's been repeatedly invoked, Freud's idea that we invent the afterlife because we want to live forever. We're upset with life, we have suffering, we have death, we imagine another world that's better. No suffering, no death, heaven. Now, the only problem with this, first of all, is that religions not only posit heaven, they also posit hell. And if you're going to make up another world to compensate for the difficulties in this one, it's very odd that you would make up hell. Hell's a lot worse than diabetes, or even death, because death is just turning off the computer. But there's an evolutionary argument against this that has now discredited the Freudian explanation. And what is that? Evolution says that we are creatures programmed to survive and reproduce. It is very costly for us to invent schemes that are not true and to invest costly resources, especially for primitive man, to give money to priests, to build cathedrals and pyramids, to invest in the next life. Evolution ruthlessly punishes that kind of extravagance. And that's why this Freudian theory, which was very fashionable 60 years ago, has fallen into disrepute among scholars. It makes no evolutionary sense. So the bottom line I'm getting at here is, in a debate like this, I've been very pleased with this debate. I think it has been actually at a higher level than a lot of debates on this kind of a topic, and even some of our debates. I think we've been able to raise it to another level. Ultimately, I want to show that the believer's position, no less than the atheist's, is an attempt to grapple with the facts, to make sense of the data, to illuminate rationally the world that we live in. Faith is not a substitute for reason. Faith only kicks in when reason comes to an end. When there are explanations and they stop. I date my wife for 3 years. I then want to decide if I should propose. I put in reason. I try to see where it goes. But then I say, what is life with her going to be like for the next 50 years? And there's no way to know. I can say, well, I'm going to be an agnostic. I'm going to wait for the data to come in. Well, if I do that, she'll marry someone else, so we'll both be dead. The data will never be in. At some point, rational knowledge has to give way to practical action. And faith is the bridge between limited, always limited human knowledge and the inevitability and necessity of human action. That ultimately is something that knowledge can teach us. Thank you very much.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, that was a meaning of life question there, wasn't it? Wherefore and whenceforth meaning. Good. A good way of winding up, if you like.
42. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
I missed something there. It went past my bat. And slightly put me off my stroke as well. Just a second. Where was it? Yes, meaning. But before I go to that, just two things on Dinesh in his last remarks. I don't think it can fairly be said in front of an audience like this that the refusal to take a faith-based position that has no evidence, in other words, a belief that there is an afterlife, or a belief that there is a supreme being, if I say I don't believe it because there's no evidence for it, it isn't even casuistry to say that that is, on my part, a faith-based statement. It's instead a refusal of faith and a refusal to use it as a method of reasoning. So it's not comparing like with like at all. Second, not just completely to defend Sigmund Freud, Dinesh is right in criticizing Freud's future of an illusion to the extent that when people are subject to wish thinking, we might expect them to be purely hedonistic, only to want the best, to say, let's imagine a comforting future while we are about it. Something that will cheer us all up. As a matter of fact, we're not as nice as all that. We don't want everyone going to hell. Excuse me, we don't want everyone going to heaven. As the old English sect used to say, we are the pure and chosen few, and all the rest are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We don't want heaven crammed. And the great existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre said that hell is other people, but actually what many people mean is hell is for other people. And they have just as strong a wish, thought, that other people suffer eternally as they have the thought and the wish for themselves that they should be in paradise. You can see it very explicitly when you see other versions of the paradise myth, like the Muslim one, or early Christian versions, where part of the pleasure of being in heaven was knowing that other people were burning forever. And that's what you'd expect of a predatory, fearful, partly evolved primate species that was making up a religious story about itself. It sounds exactly as you would expect it to do. All right, well, believing in none of that, in fact, thinking it's an evil and futile belief, people have the nerve to ask me, well, if you don't believe in heaven and hell, what gives your life meaning? Do you not detect a slight insult as well as a slight irrationality to that question? You mean I'd have much more meaning in my life if I thought that I would die and I'd be given one chance, or would have been given while I was alive, one chance, and if I'd made a mistake, I'd be condemned eternally. That was the kind of judge I'd be facing. And in the meantime, it would be advisable to live my life in propitiation of this supernatural dictator. That would lend more meaning to my life than my view counter to Pascal, contra Pascal, that if there's any such judge, I'll be able to say, at least I never faked belief in you in order to win your approbation, sir, or ma'am, as the case might be. And if you are as reported, you'll have detected that those were my thoughts, and at least I wasn't a hypocrite. Pascal says, no, at least pretend you believe. It's win-win. This is corrupt reasoning. It's the reasoning of a huckster. And it lends no meaning to life at all. Still, why do I care? For example, why do I care? Why do I care about Rwanda? Why do I care about my Iranian friends fighting theocracy? Why do I give up my own time to them? Well, I'll tell you why, and I hope, I say it, I suppose, at the risk of embarrassment. It gives me great pleasure to do so. I like to feel that since we only have one life to live, that I can help people make it free as best I can, and assist them in their real struggle for liberty, which in its most essential form is the struggle against theocracy, which is the original form that dictatorship and violation of human rights actually takes. I enjoy doing it, and I enjoy the sort of people it makes me come in contact with. And I like giving blood. Passively, I mean. I don't like spilling it, but I don't mind having it run off me in a pint, because it's, strangely enough, it's a pleasurable sensation. And you know that someone else is getting a pint of blood, and you aren't losing one, because with a strong cup of tea or Bloody Mary, you'll get it back. Or both, you'll get it back. So it used to appeal to me in my old socialist days. It's the perfect model for human solidarity. It's in your interest to do it. Someone else benefits, you don't lose, and if, like me, you have a rare blood group, you hope that other people do the same thing, so there's enough blood when your own turn comes. And it's an all-round agreeable experience. And it's not like being fearful of judgment. It's much more meaningful than that. I think it's often believed of people like myself that there's something joyless in our view. Where is the role in the atheist world, the unbelieving world, for the numinous or the ecstatic or the transcendent? Well, come on. Those of us who can appreciate poetry and music and love and friendship and solidarity are not to be treated as if we have no imagination, as if we have no moral or emotional pulse, as if we don't feel things at nightfall when music plays and friends are around, as if we don't get great pleasure when we meet. We don't meet to repeat incantations we've had dinned into us since childhood. We don't feel so insecure that we must incant and recite and go through routine and ritual. We meet to discuss our differences and to discuss the latest challenges to our worldview from people like Dinesh. We try and use the method of the Socratic dialogue even when its conclusions are unwelcome to ourselves. And though, therefore, I can't recommend atheism as morally superior, I can say that at least it faces the consequences of its belief with a certain stoicism. We might wish for eternal life, but we're not going to award it to ourselves as a prize for work we haven't yet done. So my closing recommendation is, why not try the Stoical and Socratic life for yourself? Why not examine more closely the tradition, the great tradition that we have from Lucretius and Democritus that goes through Galileo, Spinoza, Voltaire, Einstein, Russell, and many others. A tradition, I think, much greater than the fearful and the propitiatory and the ritualistic. I've been enormously grateful for your kindness in having me here. And I want to thank you again. Good night.
Thank you all for coming.